At the family meeting, my father slid a folder across the table and said, "All we need is your signature." I smiled. "You're 2 days too late," I replied. What they didn't know was that every asset, every dollar, every deed had already been moved into a trust they couldn't touch. "Hi, I'm Margot Hale. I'm 38, a financial advisor, and I've spent my whole life being the one who cleaned up everyone else's mess. But not this time. This isn't just a story about money. It's about setting boundaries, honoring legacy, and refusing to be the family's safety net forever. Stay with me, because the moment I said no was the moment everything unraveled. Come home this weekend. We need to talk." It landed like a cold slap at 9:42 a.m. on a Thursday morning. I was halfway through reviewing a client's tax shelter recommendations, seated at my neatly organized kitchen island with soft jazz playing in the background and a mug of Darjeeling cooling beside me. That text from my mother, no greeting, no details, not even a please, flashed across the top of my phone screen with all the warmth of a utility shutoff notice. I froze. The room around me stayed still, but my body shifted into a familiar mode. Tension wrapped itself around my spine like a too-tight scarf. My fingers hovered over the keyboard, suddenly useless. It had been a long time since I'd gotten one of those texts, the kind that pulled you out of your own life and flung you back into someone else's. I picked up the phone and read the message again. 5 words. Deceptively short, deeply loaded. "Come home this weekend. We need to talk." My first thought wasn't what happened. It was Noel. It's always Noel. Noel, my younger brother, has been the gravitational center of every urgent family meeting since he turned 16. He's the reason I canceled my first trip to Spain. The reason I postponed client meetings, delayed promotions, drove cross-country with a migraine, and paid for a rehab stint I didn't even know about until after the fact. He was the beautiful disaster everyone protected, and I was the invisible duct tape holding it all together. Now, at 38, divorced and living alone in a town where I don't run into anyone from my past, I had thought, maybe foolishly, that I was finally free from all that. I set my phone down, screen side down, like I was sealing it in a box. The apartment around me was calm. Morning light filtered through gauzy curtains, the scent of cedar from a candle lingered from last night. I'd created this space over the past 6 years like a sanctuary, a quiet, neutral palette where nothing screamed or sobbed or shattered. My ex-husband Jeremy used to call it cold, but he never understood that quiet wasn't the absence of warmth. It was the absence of chaos. And that for me was everything. Still, I couldn't shake the tension growing in my chest. I knew my mother, knew the tone of that message. It wasn't about Sunday brunch or asking if I'd meet her new bridge partner. It was summons pure and simple. I needed a voice of reason. I called Nina. She picked up before the second ring. "You got the text, didn't you?" I blinked. "How did you—" "Your voice," she said. "You sound like someone who's been emotionally pickpocketed." I let out a dry laugh. "That's disturbingly accurate. Let me guess. No context. Just a vague command that smells like bad news and family dysfunction." I held up my phone so she could read it. She squinted. "Come home this weekend. We need to talk." Oof, classic Lillian. Straight out of the passive-aggressive matriarch handbook. "It's about Noel," I said, already knowing I didn't need to explain further. "Of course it is. What's the over-under this time? Failed business girlfriend drama?" "Secret child." I didn't smile. I couldn't. Something about this felt different. Like the quiet before a storm I couldn't quite see, but felt approaching from all sides. Not just financially. Existentially. "I don't know," I said. "But it feels serious. Not just messy serious. Real serious." Nina leaned forward through the video screen, voice softening. "What are you going to do?" I hesitated. My first instinct was to say nothing. To protect the fragile boundaries I'd spent years building. To say I had plans, deadlines, clients' obligations. To pretend that I didn't feel that tug in my chest. The one that wasn't loyalty so much as conditioning. "I think I'm going to go," I said instead, surprising myself. She blinked. "Okay. But only if you go on your terms. not theirs. I stared past my screen at the carefully folded blanket on my couch, the stack of library books on the table, the orchid in the window I'd kept alive for nearly a year now. All quiet, all stable, all mine. I won't be the same Margot, I said. You mean the one who drops everything, walks into the fire and leaves with third-degree burns, just so no one else gets smoke in their eyes? Nina said. I nodded. I can't do that anymore, I said. I won't. And yet the guilt was still there. That whisper of, maybe this time they'll see how much you've done. Maybe this time they'll say thank you. But I knew better. This time I wouldn't pack guilt in my overnight bag. I'd pack distance clarity and a backup charger. Do you want me to drive down with you? Nina asked. No, I said. I need to do this alone. But, thanks. Then promise me this don't let them redefine you. Not again. I stared at the phone one more time. I hadn't responded yet. I typed slowly. Okay. I'll be there. But in my mind another sentence followed. I'm not the same woman you remember. He was allowed to fall. I was never allowed to be tired. That sentence has followed me for most of my adult life. I didn't coin it. I think I read it somewhere in a comment thread or maybe a memoir. But the moment I saw it, I felt something inside me unlock. It put words to the quiet truth I'd carried since childhood. Some of us are raised to be cushions, others to be caught. Noel could collapse, cry, break things, fail. I could not. I was raised to absorb. Growing up in the Hale household was like performing in a play where everyone already knew their lines. Except me. My role was written by omission. I was the quiet achiever, the one who didn't need checking in on. I learned not to ask for things because asking made people uncomfortable, especially my father Howard. He had this look, tired eyes, gentle but distant voice. And he'd always say, "You understand, right, sweetheart?" And I did. I always understood. That money was tight. That Noel was going through something. That Mom had too much on her plate. That it wasn't a good time to bring up my award, my broken bracelet, or the fact that I cried myself to sleep the night my science fair trophy got crushed in the garage. Noel once totaled our neighbor's car trying to teach himself how to drive stick. He was 13. My parents grounded him for a week and bought him pizza the second day because he'd had such a rough time. When I twisted my ankle at track tryouts, my dad asked me to walk it off and not make a scene in front of the coach. At 15, I stopped expecting fairness. At 17, I stopped needing it. Or so I thought. But not everyone in the family missed me. My grandmother Evelyn March, my mother's mother, saw something in me from the beginning. She wasn't warm in the traditional sense. She didn't hug often or gush over report cards. But when she looked at me, it felt like being seen fully. Not just for what I could endure, but for what I could become. She didn't talk down to children. She talked with them. On Saturday afternoons when I'd stay over, she'd let me sit beside her in her study, where mahogany shelves held thick leather-bound books and the windows opened to the sound of wind in the aspens. She'd pour 2 cups of chamomile tea, one with honey for her, plain for me, and spread out old newspapers and stock pages like storybooks. "This column," she said once, tapping the page, "this tells you what people believe about the future. Never invest based on today's mood. Invest based on tomorrow's value." At 12, I didn't fully understand, but I nodded, because I wanted to. When I was 16, she helped me open my first brokerage account using the money I made tutoring geometry. While my parents bought Noel a second-hand motorcycle, Evelyn gave me a copy of The Intelligent Investor with a handwritten note in the margins. "Financial independence is emotional freedom. Own both." She told me things my parents never did. You don't owe people your peace just because they share your blood. Love is not the same as sacrifice, and sometimes they pull in opposite directions. Never let guilt hold the pen when you're writing your future. At the time, I didn't realize she was preparing me, not just for money, but for survival. Evelyn was graceful in a way that made people uncomfortable. She didn't explain herself, and she didn't apologize. My mother called her too private. My father said she was hard to read. I thought she was the strongest woman I'd ever met. When she passed away, I was 29 and halfway through my MBA. I remember standing outside the church after the funeral coat buttoned to my chin, wind slapping my face, and feeling like the last adult in the family had vanished. My mother clung to my father. Noel smoked behind a pillar and didn't look up when I walked by. I sat in my car afterward and stared at the dashboard for 40 minutes, too numb to drive. A week later, I learned she had left most of her estate to me. Not to my mother. Not to Noel. Me. I didn't know how to react. Part of me felt like I'd done something wrong, like I'd stolen something. That's how warped my sense of belonging had become. Being chosen felt like betrayal. The will was specific. Evelyn left me. The Penrose estate in Crescent Glen, a sprawling colonial home that had been in our family for 4 generations. A long-term investment portfolio curated over 30 years. A private jewelry collection with heirloom pieces dating back to 1895. And a box of letters and black and white photographs. Some from her travels, some from my childhood, all handwritten and gently labeled in her neat script. The first letter I opened began simply, "Margot, I saw you," even when no one else did. I wept reading that line. I wept for the girl who had never been allowed to be tired, who had never dared to hope someone might hold space for her needs. They called it family planning. It was asset extraction. The moment I stepped into my parents' house in Boulder, I felt it. That peculiar stillness that settles just before a confrontation. The air was too still. The living room too neat, as if everything had been arranged for a performance no one wanted to star in. Noel was already there, slouched on the far end of the couch, arms crossed and eyes locked onto some fixed spot on the carpet. He didn't look up. His body language screamed avoidance, shame, or perhaps a mixture of both. I hadn't seen him in nearly a year, and time hadn't softened the edges of his restlessness. My mother Lillian greeted me with her signature brittle cheer. "Margot, sweetheart, you made it." She moved to hug me, but I stepped just slightly to the side, accepting the gesture without returning it. I wasn't here for warmth. "Of course I made it," I said. "You said it was urgent." My father Howard stood by the fireplace, papers in hand, his brow furrowed in that performative way that always accompanied what he considered serious matters. He gestured toward the chair opposite him. "Why don't we sit down? We've got a few things to walk through." That phrase, "walk through," sounded so benign. Like we were about to review a vacation itinerary instead of what I already suspected was a plan to pry something from me. I sat back, straight, face neutral. The same posture I used during high-stakes meetings with risk-averse clients. It wasn't just protection, it was armor. Howard cleared his throat, took a breath, and began. "Your mother and I have been doing some thinking. About the family's future. About stability. Long-term alignment of assets. Estate cohesion." I watched him with polite detachment. "You mean my inheritance?" His eyes flicked toward me, then away. "Your grandmother's estate, yes. But more importantly, how it fits into the broader picture of our family's financial health." "And what does that picture look like?" I asked, already knowing the answer. He handed me a printed proposal. Drafted, I noted, not by Grandma Evelyn's attorney Calvin Spencer, but someone new. The front page read, "Hale Family Trust, Structural Overview." Beneath it, a detailed plan outlining the consolidation of all inherited assets into a single, irrevocable family trust with Howard and Lillian as co-trustees. I would be a beneficiary. With input, not control, not ownership, input. I flipped through the pages, legalese wrapped in familial concern. Every clause reeked of an attempt to reframe theft as responsibility. My mother leaned in. "We know how much your grandmother left you. It's generous. More than generous, really. But we're not talking about taking anything from you. Just centralizing it. For flexibility. For protection." "For Noel," I said calmly without looking up. That silence, that too long pause, confirmed it. Howard's jaw tensed. "Your brother's made some mistakes. He's had a run of bad luck. We're trying to prevent those mistakes from spiraling." "Spiraling," I echoed, setting the papers down. "Let's call it what it is." Noel still hadn't spoken. His gaze remained low, a ghost in the corner of his own intervention. "How much?" I asked, voice low. My father exhaled slowly, deliberately. "Roughly 320,000. Some of it more time-sensitive than others." Time-sensitive, I repeated. You mean loan sharks? Lillian winced as if the word itself were vulgar. They're not criminals, just private lenders. I let that hang in the air. So let me get this straight, I said. You're asking me to give up legal control of my inheritance, an estate meant specifically for me, to bail Noel out of gambling debts with what may very well be organized crime. Not give up, my mother said gently, just share. Recenter the assets. For the family's collective future. I turned to Noel, finally meeting his eyes. He looked older than his 35 years. Paler, thinner, like someone who hadn't slept properly in months. He didn't flinch, just said flatly, You already have everything, Margot. It's my turn. I stared at him, stunned, not by the entitlement, but by how familiar it was. It was the same voice that had cried when he wrecked my bike and got rewarded with a new one. The same tone that got him out of math class but into a new car. The same script, different stage. Howard folded his hands. Your grandmother would have wanted us to stay together, to help one another. That's what families do. My heart hammered against my chest. I thought of Evelyn's voice, steady and sure. Don't confuse love with sacrifice. Sometimes they pull in opposite directions. I looked down at the folder again, then closed it slowly. I'm going to need some time, I said finally. To review this. Lillian touched my arm lightly. Just remember, honey, we can't abandon your brother. Not when he's in danger. I didn't pull away, but I didn't nod either. In my mind, I was already calling Calvin. Already mapping exit strategies. But out loud, I said only I understand. Because I did. I understood exactly what they were trying to do. And this time, I wasn't going to let them. This wasn't revenge. This was stewardship. That thought came to me as I stood in the elevator watching the numbers tick upward. My reflection in the brushed steel walls looked composed, but my hands were clenched tight around the leather strap of my bag. I wasn't here to retaliate. I was here to protect what mattered. The law offices of Kwan and Meyer occupied the 15th floor of a minimalist glass tower downtown. Rachel Kwan greeted me in a tailored navy suit and red-framed glasses that didn't soften the sharp intelligence in her gaze. I read through the summary you sent, she said, gesturing for me to follow her into a conference room overlooking the Flatirons. I think we're dealing with a potential breach of testamentary intent. Your grandmother was very clear, yes. Crystal, I replied. She left everything to me, not as a gift, but as a charge. Rachel nodded. Then we act accordingly. She laid out the plan in clipped, precise terms. We'd establish an irrevocable trust listing me as both grantor and beneficiary. Once the assets were moved, they'd be legally out of reach from any external claim, including my parents or brother. It would be airtight unless I voluntarily dismantled it. But we'll have to move fast, she warned. If your parents have already spoken to another attorney, they could file to contest or freeze the distribution process. The window to act is short. How short? 3 days. Maybe less. I breathed in slow and deep and nodded. Let's begin. The next 72 hours were a blur of paperwork, phone calls, and coordinated signatures. Rachel handled the legal documentation, working through nights and meals from her desk. Meanwhile, I reached out to Philip Granger, the attorney who'd worked with Evelyn for over 3 decades. Philip's office hadn't changed since I last visited as a teenager. Wood-paneled walls, soft leather chairs, the scent of pipe tobacco lingering in the books. His silver hair had thinned, but his mind was still sharp as glass. She always said you'd be the one, he told me as we reviewed the portfolio. She didn't trust many people, but she trusted you to carry her vision forward. Together, we transferred the Penrose Estates deed into the trust, along with the investment accounts using expedited filings. Each move felt like locking a door behind me, securing another room from the reach of people who had mistaken inheritance for entitlement. But it wasn't until I stepped into the private vault at Glenwood Bank that the emotional weight of everything hit me. The safety deposit box had been listed in my name for over a year, though I'd never opened it. The clerk led me to the private viewing room and placed the slim steel box on the table before leaving. Inside, a small collection of heirloom jewelry wrapped in velvet pouches. An old black and white photo of my grandmother as a young woman on a pier, wind tangling her hair. A stack of handwritten letters tied with a navy silk ribbon. and a slim envelope marked in Evelyn's neat script for Margot. My fingers trembled as I opened it. Margot, if you're reading this, it means you've reached the moment I feared might come. The moment where protecting what's right will require disappointing people you love. You'll be called selfish, cold, disloyal. But I know you better. I left you these things not because I loved you more, but because you understood. You understood what it means to preserve value. You saw that love and responsibility are not the same. If you protect this, you're also protecting the version of yourself I always saw. Strong, perceptive, principled. Stand firm, my girl. Some inheritances are meant to grow. Others are meant to stop a cycle. With all my heart, Grandma Evelyn. Tears welled in my eyes but didn't fall. I wasn't sad. I was steady. That letter didn't just give me permission. It gave me clarity. I returned the envelope and photo to the box, but took the jewelry and letters. I wanted them close. Not for their value, but for their weight. By the time Friday afternoon came, the last of the paperwork had been filed. Rachel confirmed the trust had been recorded, and the assets were secure. You're protected, she said, pushing the folder toward me. Legally, they can't touch a cent unless you allow it. I nodded, exhaling for what felt like the first time in days. They won't understand, I murmured. They'll think I'm heartless. Rachel didn't offer platitudes. She just said, let them. That evening I returned to the Penrose estate. The house felt different, not haunted or heavy, but expectant. As if it knew I'd done what I had to do. I sat in the library Evelyn loved so much and placed her letter in the drawer beside her old fountain pen. I imagined her sitting in that very chair scribbling notes to herself about taxes or flowers for the summer garden, knowing I might one day face this choice. This wasn't revenge. This was stewardship, and I would carry it forward, with eyes open, spine straight, and every lock secure. The air in my parents' living room was thick with anticipation when I stepped in. Afternoon light filtered through the high windows, illuminating the same furniture that had been there since I was a child. Everything looked as it always had. Chintz upholstery, a heavy grandfather clock, ticking like a slow metronome of obligation. But something fundamental had shifted. This time, I wasn't here as the fixer. Noel was already seated on the couch, arms folded tight across his chest. He didn't meet my eyes. Lillian fluttered near the fireplace, clutching a folder to her chest like it was a Bible. And Howard, always the orchestrator, stood behind the leather armchair, his expression carefully neutral, but his posture said control. Margot, my mother said, her voice falsely warm. Good you're here. We can begin. I didn't respond with pleasantries. I took the same seat I always had during these family discussions. Only now I carried something else entirely: certainty. Howard cleared his throat and moved to the coffee table, laying down a thick set of documents. We've had some legal advice, he began, about how to best honor your grandmother's legacy while making sure the family remains secure. I remained silent, watching the script play out. He opened the folder. This is the proposed structure for a family trust. It would consolidate the estate's remaining assets. Your mother and I would serve as trustees, and all distributions would be handled with transparency and fairness. Lillian leaned in. It's really just a formality, sweetheart. A way to keep everything clean, united, and helpful, Noel added flatly, to people who actually need it. I placed my hand on the table but didn't reach for the folder. There's no need for me to review that. My mother blinked. What do you mean? I met my father's gaze. The assets from Evelyn's estate have already been transferred. The Vermont property, the investment accounts, the heirlooms, they're all now under an irrevocable trust. I'm both the grantor and the beneficiary. Silence fell so heavy it seemed to press against the walls. What Howard said, a note of disbelief slicing through his voice. I've secured everything, I said calmly. Legally. Permanently. Noel sat up straighter. You what I protected. What she left me, I said. What she intended for me to protect. You have no authority over it anymore. Lillian's face crumpled first. Margot, why would you do that? We're your family, Noel scoffed. Unbelievable. You get the estate, the money, the house, and now you lock it all down. What about the rest of us? My father didn't yell, but his voice grew razor sharp. You had no right to go behind our backs like this. We'll contest it. You're welcome to try, I said, holding his gaze. But the will was valid. The trust is legally sound. And what you call secrecy, I call survival. You've always been like this, Noel snapped. Acting like you're better, like none of us matter. I turned to him, and for the first time I didn't feel that pang of guilt. You were allowed to fall, again and again, and someone was always there to cushion the landing. I was never allowed to be tired, never allowed to need. I was expected to carry quietly forever. Tears welled in my mother's eyes. She reached across the table, her fingers brushing mine. He's in trouble, Margot. This isn't just about a bad loan. It's dangerous. I know, I said, pulling my hand back gently, but saving him again would only postpone the reckoning. You both taught him that there's always a loophole, that someone will fix it. I won't be that person anymore. Howard stood, pushing the trust documents aside like they were meaningless. You would really let your brother get hurt just to make a point. This isn't about revenge, I said quietly. It's about drawing a line between help and harm, between enabling and healing. I won't burn down everything Evelyn built just so Noel can avoid another consequence. We took care of you too, Lillian said, voice trembling. Don't act like we didn't. You did what was expected, I replied. Food, shelter, school. But you never saw me. Not really. You saw my usefulness, my reliability. I was only as valuable as what I could offer. Well, this time I'm offering something else. Boundaries. Noel stood up, voice rising. So you'd rather let me get killed over a few $100,000? Is that what Evelyn would have wanted? I didn't flinch. What she wanted was for me to protect the legacy she spent her life building, and for you to finally face your life head-on. Howard's jaw clenched. You're going to regret this. We'll take this to court. We'll say you manipulated her, that she wasn't of sound mind. I stood slowly, keeping my voice level. Do what you need to do. But know this. This isn't just about money. It's about decades of being taken for granted. It stops here. Lillian began to cry, the kind of sob that was both real and strategic. I felt the usual tug in my chest, but I didn't move to comfort her. You're not being fair, she whispered. I know, I said. I'm finally being honest. Noel muttered something under his breath. Howard remained silent, calculating. Lillian just wept. I gathered my bag, heart pounding, but spine steady. As I walked toward the door, I heard my mother call after me, her voice cracking. Margot, please, don't do this. I paused, but I didn't turn around. I didn't do this. You did. I just finally stopped pretending it wasn't happening. I stepped outside into the quiet, early evening air. For a moment, I leaned against the car door, waiting for the adrenaline to subside. My hands trembled, and there was a tightness behind my eyes that wanted to break into tears. But I didn't crumble. For the first time in my life, I had rewritten the rules. And I wasn't going back. The call came just past 9. I was still in my coat, slumped on the edge of my bed, with the lights off, the house quiet, in that way that feels more like aftermath than peace. My phone buzzed once, then again. I almost didn't answer. Some instinct told me it would be more of the same, more demands, more guilt. But the name flashing across the screen stopped me. Wesley March. I hadn't spoken to my grandmother's brother since Evelyn's funeral. He hadn't been part of my childhood in any active way, just a quiet presence in family photos and the occasional memory of a soft-voiced man who never quite seemed welcome. Margot, he said when I picked up, his voice gravelly but steady. I heard what happened today. I blinked into the darkness. How Calvin Spencer gave me your number. He thought I might have something you'd want to hear. Calvin, of course. That meant this wasn't a social call. There's a cafe near Sycamore, and 8th Wesley continued. Meet me there tomorrow, 9 sharp. We won't be overheard. It wasn't a request. The next morning, I found myself seated in a booth at a near-empty diner with chipped red vinyl seats and the scent of burnt coffee lingering in the air. Wesley looked older than I remembered. His silver hair was thinner, his posture more curved, but his eyes were sharper than anyone else's in the family. I didn't think you even liked Evelyn, I said by way of greeting. He offered a faint smile. I didn't like what she became in her later years. But I respected her, more than most. We sat in silence for a moment before he reached into a leather folder and slid a small stack of papers across the table to me. Bank statements, property appraisals, loan notices, titles. Your parents are broke, he said not unkindly, have been for years. I looked at the documents at numbers so low and debt so high it didn't seem possible. The house I grew up in had not one but two mortgages against it. Their retirement accounts were drained. Their credit cards were maxed out. Every line was a breadcrumb leading back to Noel, and their refusal to ever let him fall. They sold your grandfather's coin collection 6 years ago, Wesley added, the one that was supposed to be split between you and Noel. I stared at him. They told me it was still in the family vault. It was sold to a collector in Seattle. Quiet deal. They needed the money to cover some real estate losses, and I suspect one of Noel's earlier casino tangles. I felt something inside me crack. Not loudly, not sharply, just a slow pressure release of anger that had been building for years. They hadn't just used me as a fallback plan. They'd been lying to me about the past for far longer than I realized. They thought Evelyn's estate would be their reset button, Wesley continued. Their miracle fix. She knew that, by the way. I looked up. She didn't name me in the will for a reason, he said simply. But she asked me to keep an eye out. Said if things ever got ugly, I should help you see the whole picture. I glanced at the folder again, overwhelmed. Why tell me now? Because yesterday you did something no one else in this family ever had the spine to do, he said, leaning forward. You said no. And not just for yourself. For her. For everything she built. But I figured you deserved to know what you were really standing up against. I exhaled slow and shaky. They kept saying I was abandoning them. They abandoned responsibility years ago, he said. You're not the villain here, Margot. You're the one who stayed sane in a family built on selective memory. I turned the pages again, feeling the weight of the numbers and years behind them. The web they'd woven. The lies they'd held together with polished dinner parties and forced Christmas photos. She trusted you to lead, Wesley said gently. Not to save. There's a difference. I let that sink in. My grandmother hadn't chosen me because I was the strongest or the most dutiful. She chose me because I was the only one who saw beyond short-term chaos. Because I didn't confuse sacrifice with love. Because I understood that preserving a legacy sometimes means letting people face the collapse of their own poor choices. I looked back at Wesley. Why did she ask you to help? She said if there was anyone in the family who'd know what it's like to walk away from dysfunction, it was me, he replied. And she was right. Outside, the wind rustled the last of the autumn leaves against the windows. I gathered the papers, tucking them carefully into my bag. Thank you, I said quietly. Wesley nodded once, solemn. Don't let them twist the story, Margot. You didn't betray the family. You're the first one who ever tried to change the ending. I stepped out into the crisp morning, the sky overcast but clearing. The truth hadn't made anything easier, but it had made something possible. Clarity, direction, resolve, and most of all, a deep grounded certainty. I was never meant to be their lifeboat. I was meant to be the one who built something that could survive the storm. For the first time in my adult life, I invited my family into my space. Not for a holiday, not out of obligation, but on my terms. The living room of my Ashfield home had never hosted this many emotions at once. The long oak table, usually a quiet place for morning coffee and spreadsheet reviews, was now a stage for something far more delicate, the possibility of rebuilding. I'd chosen every part of the setting deliberately. No dining room hierarchies, no formal seating to assert power. Just chairs in a gentle circle, warm light from the floor lamp, a pot of jasmine tea steeping on the sideboard. I wanted clarity without confrontation. Rachel sat to my right, her legal pad balanced neatly on one knee. Wesley was across from me, his expression unreadable, but alert. And Nina, who had offered to sit in, not as a referee, but as emotional scaffolding, rested a steady hand on the arm of the chair beside mine. My parents arrived first. Lillian with a casserole in a quilted tote, as if dinner could soften the battlefield. Howard carried nothing, not even a folder this time, perhaps sensing that strategy was no longer his strongest suit. They looked at the people assembled and seemed to understand this would not be a typical conversation. Noel came last. He looked like someone who hadn't slept in days. A hoodie pulled over his ears, jeans, wrinkled eyes downcast. Still he came. That mattered. I let a beat pass before I spoke. "Thank you for coming," I said, my voice steady. "I know this isn't easy." Lillian nodded but said nothing. Howard watched me like he was waiting for a cross-examination. Noel kept staring at the floor. "I'll get straight to it. The trust remains untouched. The assets are protected. That's not up for discussion." Silence, but the weight of it was different this time. Less surprise, more bracing. However, I continued, "That doesn't mean I'm not willing to help. But any help I offer will come with conditions." Howard shifted in his seat. "So this is what, a negotiation?" "No," I replied. "It's a boundary and an offering." I turned to Noel. "You need help. Real help. Not a bailout. Not another band-aid. I've spoken with a residential treatment center outside Ithaca. They specialize in gambling addiction, 90-day program full-time with aftercare." His eyes flicked up to mine. "How? How much does that cost?" "I'll cover it. With my own money. Not Evelyn's." He blinked, clearly not expecting that. But before he could respond, I held up a hand. "But if you walk out halfway or relapse without returning to treatment, the support stops. No more second chances. This is it." He nodded, slowly, swallowing hard. Then I turned to my parents. "You've spent years trying to protect him from consequences. I understand that now, even if I disagree, but that protection has come at enormous cost." Lillian opened her mouth to speak, then closed it again. "You need to sell the house," I said plainly. "It's not sustainable. The mortgage payments, the upkeep, none of it fits your financial reality. I can help you assess your options, restructure debt, maybe even preserve some assets for retirement. But I won't let you bury yourselves hoping a miracle appears." Howard bristled. "You want us to downsize our lives after everything we've built?" "No," I said gently. "I want you to be free from the lie that you still can afford it." It landed. Hard. But honestly, I'll provide financial guidance. I won't charge you, I added. But I expect transparency. I won't rescue anyone blindly. They looked at one another. Lillian's hands clutched each other in her lap. Howard stared at a point on the carpet, jaw clenched. "This isn't punishment," I said. "It's the only way this family survives with integrity." Rachel spoke for the first time. "These terms protect everyone involved, legally and emotionally. We can draft support agreements to ensure clarity." Still no one spoke. Then Noel did. His voice was low, scratchy. "I know I've messed up. I know I don't deserve this." I shook my head. "This isn't about what anyone deserves. It's about whether we want to break the pattern." "I'm scared," he said, voice cracking. "But I'll go." Lillian reached for his hand. "We just didn't want to lose him," she whispered. "You didn't," I said. "But you almost lost yourselves. And me." Howard finally looked up. "We'll sell the house," he said. "You're right." For a moment the room held something close to peace. Not resolution, not yet. But the beginning of a path forward that didn't require betrayal or erasure. We spent the next hour going over logistics. Timelines, program admission, real estate contacts. Rachel took notes. Wesley offered to help coordinate the move. Nina squeezed my hand once quietly. As the meeting wrapped up, Noel lingered behind while the others shuffled toward the door. He looked older than his years, but clearer somehow. "I meant it," he said. "I'll try. I'm really going to try." "I know," I said. "Trying is the only thing that ever mattered." He hesitated, then added, "Thank you for not giving up on me. Even when you should have." I smiled, a little tired, a little hopeful. "I didn't give up. I just stopped lying to myself about what helping looks like." He nodded, then turned to leave. When the door closed behind him, I exhaled a breath I hadn't realized I'd been holding. This wasn't reconciliation in the fairy tale sense, but it was something else. Harder, more real. A family, maybe. Finally building something on solid ground. The frost had lifted from the lawns of Penrose Estate, leaving the grass soft and uneven beneath the soles of Margot's boots. She stood on the wraparound porch, coffee in hand, wrapped in a gray wool shawl that had once belonged to her grandmother Evelyn. The restoration was nearly complete now. Ivy trimmed back with care, the shutters repainted in historical slate blue, and the original banisters reinforced but preserved. The work had taken time, longer than she expected. But then again, so had healing. Inside the house was quiet, save for the soft ticking of the grandfather clock in the foyer. Margot liked it that way. After years of noise, emotional, financial, familial, quiet was not just a comfort, but a choice. She still checked in with her family, not often, not out of obligation, just enough to know that honesty hadn't cracked apart the foundation of their connection, it had simply rebuilt it on something sturdier. Noel had completed his 90-day residential program 3 months ago. He now worked at a greenhouse on the edge of town tending to orchids and ferns like they were breathing companions. He had chosen the job himself without suggestion or push. For someone who used to chase the high of immediate results, he now took quiet pride in repotting plants, tracking their growth, learning how to nurture what took time. He had even started managing his debt with a nonprofit financial advisor. Nothing flashy, just real intentional effort. Margot hadn't asked for updates. He gave them freely. Her parents had downsized as planned. The colonial-style home in Boulder sold within weeks. They moved into a modest 2-bedroom condo near the public library. Howard had taken a part-time position as counsel at a smaller firm. Less prestige, but steadier than trying to salvage the remnants of his old practice. Lillian had joined a book club and in a surprising twist started taking watercolor classes. There were awkward calls, still moments of defensiveness. Some silences were still loaded, but Margot noticed something else: too fewer excuses, more quiet admissions. No more pushing her to reconsider the trust or veiled suggestions about future emergencies. The old dynamics hadn't vanished, but they were no longer invisible, and that made all the difference. On the first Sunday of every month, she invited them to lunch, nothing elaborate, soup, fresh bread, a little wine. Sometimes they came, sometimes they didn't. That too was a kind of healing, allowing space. One chilly morning in early April, Margot received a letter from the regional bank where Evelyn had kept a safety deposit box. They had recently updated their digital cataloging system, and a final envelope, filed under a miscoded name, had surfaced. It had been missed during the original inventory. She drove to the bank that afternoon, heart heavy with a mix of curiosity and grief. Inside the envelope was a small, folded sheet of stationery, Evelyn's familiar cursive etched in blue ink across the page. My dearest Margot, if you're reading this, you've likely faced the choice I always feared for you. The one where love and truth pull in different directions. You may feel cruel. They may call you selfish, but boundaries are not cruelty. They are survival. They might hate you for the boundary, but one day they'll thank you for not letting them drown. Love, Grandma. Evelyn. Margot read the letter twice, then folded it with reverence and tucked it back into the envelope. She didn't cry this time. She didn't have to. It wasn't sorrow she felt. It was alignment. Her grandmother had seen her clearly, even when no one else had. That evening, as twilight painted the estate in amber hues, her phone rang. A number she now recognized instantly. "Hi, Noel," said his voice, softer but firmer. "It's me." "Hey," she answered, sinking into the old velvet chair in the library. The same spot where Evelyn used to read her Agatha Christie novels on rainy afternoons. 6 months clean today, he said. Margot smiled, her hand tightening slightly around the phone. "That's wonderful, Noelle. How are you feeling?" He paused, grateful, still scared sometimes, but also more present than I can ever remember. There was a silence, not awkward, just full. "I wanted to thank you," he added, "not just for helping, but for not giving up on me, even when I gave up on myself." She breathed in slow and full. The words landed gently, but they didn't erase the past. "That wasn't their job. That's not what family does," she said finally. "Family tells the truth, even when it hurts." He didn't speak right away. Then, That's the part I'm trying to learn. Telling the truth, not just to you, to myself. They spoke for a few more minutes. About the greenhouse, about a new book he was reading, even about the upcoming tulip festival in town. When the call ended, Margot sat in the quiet for a long time, staring out the window at the newly planted magnolia tree just beyond the porch. What Evelyn had left her wasn't just property or jewelry or market indexes. It was a map, a guide for choosing truth over comfort, clarity over guilt, strength over silence. A new kind of inheritance. One measured not in dollar signs, but in boundaries kept in identities reclaimed in peace that didn't rely on anyone's approval. The house would never be perfect, neither would the people in it. But Margot had stopped waiting for perfection. She had chosen something braver, real. And in that truth, she found the freedom that her family, finally, was beginning to understand. If you've ever felt like the dependable one, expected to hold everything together while no one noticed the cost, you're not alone. Margot's story isn't just about inheritance or family drama. It's about the invisible labor so many of us carry, and the quiet strength it takes to finally say enough. Have you ever had to draw a boundary that others didn't understand? What legacy would you want to leave behind? Not just in wealth, but in wisdom. Let us know your thoughts in the comments. We read everyone. And if this story resonated with you, please consider subscribing to our channel and hitting the notification bell so you won't miss more real-life stories about courage, self-worth, and finding your voice, no matter how late it arrives. Thanks for listening. And wherever you are, may you find the strength to protect what matters most, even when it's hard.